Hey all, so I got this request about making a dynamic JotForm with information sourced from Airtable, essentially with the idea of having a dynamic dropdown inside of a JotForm, whereby we would query the options from an Airtable base, then choose, for example, a specific customer, and then show the linked records, again, querying it from Airtable to be able to select by the user. Now, here's how the final result will look like. We have this Airtable database with two tables, customers and orders. In customers, each customer has an ID, a name, and then is connected to several orders, while the orders table has, again, an order ID, a name, and an associated customer. Now, the final result of the JotForm will look like this. We'll be able to choose the customer. Again, when the form will be refreshed, it will query it from Airtable, so it's completely dynamic. We choose the customer, and then depending on that, we'll be able to choose any of the orders associated with that customer. If we now change it to, for example, to another one, it will again query the Airtable base and get all the orders associated with that new customer. We'll be able to add some other fields and then submit and view it inside of our JotForm software. Now, how do we go about this? So first of all, we would like to have endpoints with which we'll be able to get the information from Airtable. And to design that, we can actually use Integromat. The first workflow that I have created is for getting all the customers from the Airtable base. Because why do we need this as well? Because obviously we could just query it directly from, let's say, our web page, directly from the Airtable API, but that would mean we actually have to expose our Airtable API key to a public web page, which we obviously don't want to do. So that's why we create this this custom webhooks and endpoints in Integromat. So the first step for this one of getting customers would be a webhook. Once that is activated using a GET request, it will search all the Airtable records in a specific database. In this case, customers. So we're just getting all of them from customers with a limit of, let's say, 100. We aggregate it in an array with their IDs of the record, the customer ID, which is custom, and the name. Then we finally convert it into JSON, right? So just simply converting the array that we get from here into JSON, and then sending it as a webhook response with status code of, let's say, 201, which means a success. The body will be the JSON string, and then the custom header will be content type application JSON, so that the receiving client knows that it is actually JSON data. Now, let's test this endpoint with Postman. So we'll copy the address to the clipboard. We'll go to Postman, and we already have it set up over here. So if we query it, as you can see, we get our two records for customers with their name, customer ID, and the record ID from Airtable. Now, great. The second point would be actually creating an endpoint for getting orders from a specific customer. Again, the trigger will be a webhook to which we'll send a GET request. And inside of this GET request, as we can see here in Postman, we'll have a query parameter of customer ID, right? That is a specific customer that we want to get the orders for. Again, the first step is getting searching records in Airtable. In this case, we are searching the orders database, and the formula for the filter will be customer equals and the customer ID that we get from the webhook. Again, the limit, let's say 100. Again, then we aggregate this into an array with their record IDs, order ID, and the order name. Transform it to JSON, and then send as a webhook response with status 201, body again JSON string, and content type application dot JSON. Let's test out in Postman for example, customer ID equals C1. As you can see, we get these two orders, so computers and phones for the first one. And if we now change it to C2, we'll get just one order as we do have in the base. Okay, so our endpoints are created. How do we actually implement them inside of JotForm? And for this, really, we would have to do some coding with some JavaScript and HTML involved, as JotForm does not actually provide a dynamic drop-down field by default. So to actually create that, we'll have to first create, let's say, the base of our form in the JotForm online builder. We'll have a customer dropdown, an order dropdown, and let's say a comment field. And then what we'll have to do is actually download the source code of this form to actually be able to customize it and add some custom JavaScript to it. So we'll go into embed over here and source code. When we download the source code, we'll get a zipped file called something source code. And in here we'll have two folders, the CSS for styling, JavaScript with some files needed for the form to work, and finally the HTML file. We'll just be modifying the HTML file this time, so let's get into our editor and look at it. As you can see here, we have the base of all our form with some scripts at the top and some HTML at the bottom over here, defining all of our fields. Now, if we actually open it up, it looks just like this. And let me walk through the changes that I have made to the file. Well, first of all, here you can find the two dropdowns, the customer dropdown and the order dropdown. I have actually gone ahead, and the only changes I have made to the actual HTML code was adding an ID of customer dropdown for this one and removing all of the options except the first one. And for the order dropdown, again, adding an ID and removing all the options altogether, and you'll understand in a bit why that happens. All right, so that's all really with the HTML. Now, as for the JavaScript part, we can do this in several ways, but I decided to go with jQuery, which is actually a library that helps us, let's say, query parameters, HTML elements in an easier way, a more straightforward way. So we include it by adding this script tag. You can find it on the jQuery website. And then we add a custom script of JavaScript over here. All right, so let me walk through this again. Now, when the document is ready, so that is the standard functionality of jQuery, when all the document has been loaded, so the page and all the elements are already loaded into the browser, we'll first of all define two variables, which will be the get customers URL and that get orders URL. This will be the webhooks that we have defined in Integromat. The first one will be just a simple URL, and the second one will be the URL plus let's say the start of our query, which will be customer ID equals, and then to the end of it we'll add the specific customer that we want to query for. After that, we'll disable dropdowns, the two dropdowns that we have until actually the data is fetched. In that way, we'll make sure that the customer doesn't accidentally change something that they shouldn't be able to change in the dropdown. So we get our element by its ID customer dropdown, okay, and then a specific property, which is called disabled in HTML, we set it to true, okay, and the same we do for order dropdown. Now, the next step is actually getting the customers and updating the first dropdown, okay? That will be only done once, so when the page is loaded, and after that, those options will remain in place. To do this, we actually use a GET request, and jQuery has this very nice feature called getJSON, which actually converts JSON automatically from the GET response that we execute, and makes it readily available in data over here. Okay, so we query the get customers URL defined above, and as a result we get the data. We then define an empty array, which will be called custom options, that where we actually store the HTML elements of the different options that we have for each customer. And then for each element in data, which will actually be just an array of all the customers, as we can see over here in Postman. So we have an array with 2 objects. So for each element in this array, we will first take its index and then the object itself, and we'll push, so add to this array customer options that we have just defined previously, this code. Okay, so option value, this is essentially the internal value that will be stored inside of the HTML element, and this will be just our customer ID. Okay, so that we can then reference it when we submit the form, and also when we query for orders. And then let's say the display name, right? So that's actually the value that the user sees, will be customer.name, which will, in this case, Amazon and at Google. Okay, and then we close the tag. All of this as well can be found in normal HTML documentation. Okay, after that, we'll also write to the log, and this is mostly for debugging purposes, the customer options that the array that we have finalized. And we will append our customer dropdown, okay, with these customer options. Essentially what append does, it goes to this specific element, right? And straight at the back of it, so just before the closing tag, it adds the elements that we want to add. So in this case, we add all of these options with each one of the customers that we have queried for. After that, when all of this get JSON request is finished, we enable our customer dropdown by setting the property of disabled to false. Fantastic. All of that is ready, and once that is ready, we get the orders whenever a customer is selected. Okay, so we attach, let's say, an event listener to the customer dropdown over here, and whenever it is changed, this function will be executed with this specific event, all the information stored about the event in this variable called E. Okay, so first of all, we will again log the order dropdown before continuing. This is just to make sure that, for example, if it is not the first time that a new customer is selected, right? To make sure that we can log the order dropdown and make sure that the customer does not select something that they shouldn't be able to select. We then empty all the child elements of the order dropdown, essentially making sure that any of the previous options that we have queried for another customer are gone, and then get the customer ID from this .value, which will essentially reference the customer dropdown value that was selected. Okay, that's the one that we defined actually here. So it will contain the customer ID. We then make a request again to our endpoint, again get JSON. In this case, we have the get orders URL defined over here, and then we add to the back of it the customer ID. So that in this case, customer ID equals, then for example, C1. Again, we get a response in data, and this is again an array, just like this one, with objects for each specific order. We can define an empty array called order options. We go through each element in the data array, and we push into the order options an option HTML element with the value of order ID. And then as the display name, we will have order ID and then the order name as well. We then do a console log as well of the order options, and we append the order dropdown with the order options that we have created. After that, we enable the order dropdown, and actually that's it. So just to review, we have queried first, and then when the page was loaded, we have queried the get customers URL endpoint for all the customers and added them to the customer dropdown, and then added a listener, an event listener, for a change event in the customer dropdown so that whenever we select a new customer, any of the options that we already created in the order dropdown will be deleted, and then we'll get the orders associated with that customer using our second endpoint over here. Okay, now everything is ready. Let's save and let's go over here. Again, we have enabled the two workflows in scenarios in Integromat. And actually, let's inspect this and see as well the console log that we get for both of them. So when we reload, first of all, the customer values are loaded. And as you can see over here, again, we get this array of the two options that we are adding to the HTML code in the dropdown select element. And then whenever we actually change it and select one of these values, let's say Amazon, a new query is issued, we get all the orders associated with that specific customer. As you can see here, the two option elements that are added over here, and then we can select. And whenever we change again a customer to a different one, these ones are deleted, and we get a new array with all the options. Fantastic. Let's now write as well a comment and submit. Make sure that I'm human, just in case. Okay, so we want a boat. This can be tricky sometimes. Okay, all verified. We submit the form. Fantastic. And then if we go to our inbox, we'll see the submission with, again, the values, right, that we have defined in our options, which are just the identifiers of the customer ID and the order ID, which we can then pass to other automations or perform other actions with. Now, I hope that this was insightful and that you'll enjoy creating dynamic forms with JotForm and Airtable. There are some tools such as Onto Air and some others, or Tele, for example, that will be able to drive a similar functionality. But if you want a custom code implementation with no additional software, that is the way to go. Thank you for watching.